The sun was dipping low across the wide desert sky, painting the land in soft orange and gold. Daniel rode slowly on his horse, Dusty, toward the Apache camp. He had been here many times before, bringing supplies, sharing meals, and trading small goods. Unlike most cowboys, Daniel had never looked at the Apache people with suspicion or hate. He saw them as human beings with their own pride, their own ways, and their own wisdom. That was why Chief Dakota trusted him more than other settlers. Daniel was tall, lean, and weathered from long years under the sun. His hands were rough, his shirt worn, and his hat-shaded eyes that had seen both hardship and kindness. Life had never been easy for him, but he had always chosen to walk the honest road. Whenever he shook someone's hand, his word meant something. That was rare in those times, and people, whether settlers or tribesmen, respected that about him. That evening, the camp was quiet in a way Daniel did not like. Usually there were sounds of children playing, of women preparing food, of men talking near the fire. Instead, the camp was hushed. As Daniel approached, two young women looked at him with worried eyes. He recognized them, Naya and Ahioka, the wives of Chief Dakota. Naya, the older one, carried herself with calm strength. Ahioka, younger, was more fiery, her spirit quick to show on her face. They motioned for him to follow. Daniel dismounted, tied Dusty near a tree, and walked inside the chief's lodge. The air was heavy with the smell of herbs burning slowly. Chief Dakota lay on a mat of woven fibers, his face pale, his breath shallow. Age and sickness had weakened the strong leader who once rode fearlessly across the plains. Daniel's heart tightened at the sight. Dakota lifted his head slightly when Daniel came close. His eyes, though tired, still held their sharpness. He whispered in the Apache tongue first, then switched to broken English so Daniel could understand. "Brother, you came." Daniel knelt down. "I came as soon as I heard." "What can I do?" The old chief gave a faint smile. "You have done much already. You gave us fair trade. You gave us respect. You gave us trust when others gave us hate." He coughed, and Naya quickly placed water to his lips. Daniel looked at Naya. Her face was calm, but her eyes were wet. Ahioka stood behind her, her fists clenched tight, anger and fear battling inside her. Dakota placed a trembling hand on Daniel's arm. "I am leaving this world. My spirit will walk with the ancestors. But these two women, my wives, they will remain. Alone, the world will be cruel. Some will treat them as burdens. Others will treat them as prey." His voice grew weaker, but his words carried weight. "I want you, Daniel, to protect them. To see them safe. Promise me this." Daniel froze. The request was heavy, unexpected. A cowboy caring for two Apache women. He knew what people would say. Settlers would mock him, call him names. Some of the tribe might not understand either. But when he looked into the old chief's eyes, he saw no selfishness, no trickery, only a fatherly fear for the future of those he loved. Daniel lowered his head and spoke softly. "I promise, Chief, I will not let harm come to them." The old man sighed with relief, as if a great burden had lifted. His hand slipped away from Daniel's arm, and his chest rose and fell slowly. "Good. You are a man of your word," he whispered. Within minutes, the chief closed his eyes for the last time. His breathing stopped, and silence filled the lodge. Naya knelt beside her husband, whispering words of farewell in her language. Ahioka turned away, her body shaking with quiet sobs. Daniel stood there, feeling the weight of what had just been placed upon his shoulders. Outside, the camp began to wail in mourning as the news spread. Fires burned through the night as the tribe honored their leader's spirit. Daniel stayed with them, not as an outsider, but as someone who had been entrusted with something sacred. He did not speak much, but he stayed close to Naya and Ahioka, making sure no harm or insult touched them in the confusion of grief. The following morning, when the burial rites were completed, Daniel prepared to leave. He expected the tribe might want him gone, that they would keep the women among their own people. But instead, the elders gathered and nodded toward him. Naya stepped forward. "He trusted you. We will follow." Daniel's throat went dry. He had no desire to own anyone, no desire to take wives by force of promise. But he could not dishonor Dakota's last wish. "I will keep you safe," he said simply. The journey back to Daniel's ranch was quiet. The women rode behind him, their belongings few. The desert stretched wide, silent except for the sound of hooves. Daniel wondered what kind of life lay ahead. He was just a cowboy with a small ranch, struggling to keep his cattle alive, struggling to keep his land free from greedy hands. How would he provide for 2 women, protect them from prejudice, and balance the world's judgment? When they reached the ranch, Daniel set them up in the small cabin beside his main house. It was plain but clean, with a roof that did not leak and a door that locked against trouble. He gave them space, knowing they would need time to grieve and adjust. That night, as Daniel sat on his porch staring at the stars, he felt the full weight of the promise. The land was silent except for the cry of coyotes in the distance. He thought of the chief's final look, the trust in those fading eyes. Life had handed him many challenges, but this was unlike any other. He had not inherited land, money, or cattle. He had inherited lives, 2 women who now depended on his word, his honor, and his protection. And as the night wind swept across the desert, Daniel made a vow to himself. No matter the cost, no matter the whispers of neighbors, no matter the danger, he would keep his promise. Because in the West, a man's word was all he truly had. The days that followed were not easy for Daniel. The weight of his promise sat heavy on his shoulders. He had always been a man of his word, but this was no small thing. He was no longer only a cowboy struggling to keep his ranch alive. Now he was the guardian of 2 women who carried the spirit of a tribe within them. At first, the ranch felt divided. Daniel lived in his small main house while Naya and Ayoka stayed in the cabin he had prepared. He made sure they had food, water, and firewood, but he kept his distance, not wanting them to feel like prisoners or dependents. He wanted them to feel safe, not owned. Still, he could sense the unspoken questions in their eyes. What would this new life mean for them? Would he treat them with kindness or use them as others might? Naya was calm, her face often thoughtful, as if she carried wisdom far beyond her years. She tried to make the best of the situation. She cooked with the food Daniel brought, and added her own touches by foraging herbs and roots from the land. She cleaned the small cabin and made it a home. She seemed determined to keep some dignity in this strange new life. Ayoka, however, found it harder to adjust. She was younger, with fire in her spirit. She had been proud in her tribe, full of laughter and energy, and now she felt trapped in a life she had not chosen. Often she looked at Daniel with suspicion, as though waiting for him to reveal selfish intentions. She worked, but her movements carried tension, and her silence often felt heavy. Daniel noticed but said little. He gave them space, treating them with respect. Every morning he rose before dawn, worked with the cattle, mended fences, and kept the ranch going. He let them see through action, not words, that his promise to the dying chief was not a burden to him but a duty he had accepted fully. But the outside world did not stay quiet. Word spread quickly through the nearby town that Daniel was living with 2 Apache women. In the saloon, whispers turned into laughter and laughter turned into sharp words. Some called him a fool. Others called him worse. A few suggested that he had gained some secret advantage from the tribe, maybe land or treasure. When Daniel rode into town for supplies, he felt the eyes on him. Men stared. Women whispered behind fans. The storekeeper, who had once greeted him warmly, now spoke with a careful tone, his smile not reaching his eyes. Daniel pretended not to notice, but inside he felt the sting. One afternoon, outside the general store, a ranch hand spat on the ground and muttered just loud enough for others to hear, "Cowboy lost his way," bringing Indians into his house. Daniel stopped, looked at the man, and calmly said, "I keep my promises." That's more than most men can say. Then he walked on, leaving silence behind him. He knew fighting every insult would lead to endless trouble. Instead, he chose to live with quiet strength. Back at the ranch, Naya began to notice his struggles. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the cattle grazed in peace, she came to him while he fixed a fence. "They do not see you the way I do," she said softly. Daniel glanced at her. "And how do you see me?" She paused, her dark eyes steady. "As a man who kept his word when it was not easy." The simple words gave Daniel more comfort than he could say. Life on the ranch slowly began to shape itself into a new rhythm. Naya found ways to help. She had deep knowledge of plants and healing. When a calf fell ill, she brewed a mixture from desert herbs that brought the animal back to strength. Daniel began to see her not only as someone he protected, but as someone who carried knowledge he could never have learned on his own. Ayoka, though slower to trust, began to reveal her own strengths. She had a natural skill with horses. At first, she would only stand by the corral watching, her arms crossed. But one day when Daniel struggled with a young wild horse, she stepped forward, her voice calm, her movements gentle. To his surprise, the horse obeyed her touch. After that, Daniel let her help, and little by little she found her place in the daily work of the ranch. Even so, Ayoka often tested Daniel with sharp words. "Why did you not refuse my husband's wish?" she asked one evening, her tone almost accusing. Daniel thought for a moment before answering. "Because when a man gives you his trust with his last breath, you do not walk away, not if you want to call yourself a man." She looked at him long, as if weighing his soul, and then turned away without reply. But the next morning she worked beside him with more willingness than before. The land itself was another test. That summer brought little rain, and the ground cracked under the sun. Grass was scarce and the cattle grew thin. Daniel worked from dawn to dusk, trying to keep his herd alive, while Naya and Ayoka helped gather what little food could be found. The three of them often ended the day exhausted, sitting in silence, sharing only the comfort of survival together. In those quiet evenings, the bond between them grew, though none spoke it aloud. They were no longer strangers forced together by fate, but companions tied by shared struggle. Daniel began to realize that this was not a simple promise anymore. It was becoming a life built together in hardship and in trust. But the outside world was not done with them. Rumors continued to stir in town. Some settlers said Daniel was dangerous now, too close to the tribe. Others whispered that he had betrayed his kind. One day, two young cowboys rode near his ranch and shouted insults at Naya and Ayoka as they worked outside. Daniel confronted them standing tall, his rifle across his arm. Without raising his voice, he warned them never to come back. The cowboys laughed at first, but when they saw the steady look in his eyes, they turned their horses and rode away. That night, Ayoka sat quietly by the fire. At last she spoke. "You did not have to do that for us." Daniel looked at her with a calm expression. "Yes, I did. Because I gave my word." Ayoka said nothing more, but her eyes softened, and for the first time, Daniel saw trust in them. As summer turned toward autumn, the ranch began to settle into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. The women were no longer seen only as dependents, but as vital to the ranch's survival. Daniel was no longer just a cowboy alone, but the head of a strange, unlikely family that stood strong together. He knew troubles would come again. From the land, from men, from prejudice. But as he watched Naya grinding herbs for medicine, and Ayoka leading a wild colt with firm hands, Daniel felt something shift inside him. He was no longer carrying a burden. He was carrying a bond, one that might one day prove stronger than the judgment of the world. And deep down, he realized that the chief's last wish had given him not just responsibility, but also a new kind of strength he had never known before. Autumn slipped quietly across the land, and Daniel's ranch carried the weight of change. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the work never ended. For Daniel, the promise he had made to Chief Dakota was no longer just a duty spoken at a deathbed. It had become the very shape of his life. Naya and Ayoka were now part of his world, and whether the neighbors approved or not, that truth could not be undone. But not everyone saw it that way. Whispers in the town grew sharper. A few men in the saloon claimed that Daniel had betrayed his own people. Some said he was siding with the Apaches against the settlers. Others spread stories that he had taken Dakota's wives as trophies, twisting his promise into something ugly. Daniel kept his silence, refusing to give fuel to gossip. But silence, he realized, could not stop suspicion. Tension first showed itself when two ranchers arrived one morning at Daniel's gate. They were older men, rough and proud, with wide hats pulled low and rifles strapped across their saddles. Their faces carried the look of men who believed they owned the land by right, and their eyes did not hide their disdain. "Daniel," one of them said, spitting dust from his mouth, "we heard you've taken in Indians. That true?" Daniel stood steady, leaning on the fence. "I've given shelter to two women who needed it." "That's all you need to know," the man scowled. "They don't belong here. You're asking for trouble. First it's two women, next thing, the whole tribe shows up at your door." "The tribe won't trouble you," Daniel said firmly. "But I'll tell you this, no one here is your concern. My land, my choice." The men exchanged looks, muttered curses, and rode off. But Daniel knew it was not the last he would see of them. Trouble had a way of circling back. Naya sensed the unease. That evening, while she tended a pot of stew over the fire, she said softly, The world outside your ranch grows restless. They do not understand why you keep us here. Daniel took a seat, his shoulders heavy. They don't need to understand. What matters is that you're safe. That's the promise I gave. Ayoka, sitting nearby, spoke sharply. Safe? They hate us. They will come for us. You cannot fight them all. Daniel looked at her, his voice calm but firm. I'll fight if I must, but I'd rather show them that we're not enemies. Her eyes flashed with doubt, but she said nothing more. Yet beneath her defiance, a small flicker of respect was beginning to grow. The days passed with small victories and small fears. Naya helped heal a sick calf with her herbs, impressing Daniel again with her wisdom. Ayoka proved her skill with horses, breaking in a wild colt that no one else could touch. Slowly, the ranch began to breathe with new life, but beyond the fences, unease stirred. One afternoon, as Daniel returned from town with a wagon of supplies, he saw riders gathered near the ridge, watching. He recognized them as young Apache warriors. Their faces were painted, their eyes hard. He stopped his horse and waited. At last one rode forward. You are Daniel, the young man said in broken English. You keep our chief's wives. That is not your place. Daniel's voice was steady. Your chief asked me with his last breath. I gave him my word. The young warrior's eyes narrowed. They belong with the people, not with you. They belong where they choose, Daniel replied. And they chose to follow me. I will protect them. That's my promise. The warriors muttered among themselves, then turned their horses and rode away. But Daniel knew their anger was not finished. Now he stood between two fires, the suspicion of the settlers and the resentment of the young Apache men. Back at the ranch, he told Naya and Ayoka what had happened. Naya closed her eyes, sadness on her face. They are proud and young. They see dishonor where there's only duty, but in time they will learn. Ayoka clenched her fists. They should not decide for us. We chose to come here. Why can they not see it? Daniel looked at her with quiet respect. Because choice is something many men fear. It means freedom, and freedom threatens their power. That night, the wind howled across the plains, rattling the shutters and stirring the dry grass. Daniel sat on his porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the horizon. He felt the storm gathering, not of nature, but of men. He wondered how long peace could last when both sides saw him as an enemy. Yet even in the tension, there were moments of unexpected closeness. Naya often brought Daniel a bowl of stew after long hours of work, and they would share quiet words by the fire. Ayoka, once full of suspicion, began to ride with him across the land, helping to round up straying cattle. She challenged him with questions, sharp and bold, but there was curiosity now instead of mistrust. One evening, as they rode back under a sky painted red by the setting sun, Ayoka asked, "Why do you not fear being alone against so many?" Daniel thought for a moment before answering. Because fear never saved a man. Only honor does. If I lose everything else, I still have my word. That's enough. She studied him silently, and though she said nothing, Daniel could see something change in her eyes. The weeks turned harder when winter winds began to bite. Food grew scarce and the cattle struggled. Daniel worked himself to exhaustion, chopping wood, repairing roofs, hunting what little game he could find. Naya tended to his wounds and aches with her herbs, while Ayoka took charge of the horses, keeping them alive through the cold. The three of them leaned on each other, bound not by choice alone but by survival. Still, danger was never far. One cold morning, Daniel woke to find hoofprints circling the ranch, too many to be harmless. Someone had been watching in the night. He said nothing to worry the women, but he kept his rifle closer than ever. As the days dragged on, the ranch became both a haven and a target. For every moment of peace, Daniel knew a storm brewed beyond the horizon. The settlers whispered, the young warriors glared, and the land itself tested them with hunger and cold. Yet within those trials, something unspoken grew between the three. They were no longer strangers tied by a dying man's wish. They were becoming a family, forged by hardship, sharpened by danger, and bound by a promise that no prejudice could break. And though Daniel never spoke it aloud, deep inside he knew that what had begun as a burden was becoming the truest part of his life. Winter came down hard on Daniel's ranch. The sky turned gray for days at a time, and the cold bit through clothes, walls, and skin. Each morning Daniel rose before the sun, his breath clouding in the frozen air. He carried buckets of water for the cattle, chopped wood until his arms ached, and checked fences that had been broken by storms. The land seemed to fight him at every turn. Naya and Ayoka worked just as tirelessly. Naya searched the barren fields for roots and herbs, carrying baskets even when the ground was frozen. She brewed teas that warmed their bodies and healed Daniel's tired muscles. Ayoka, with her natural skill, cared for the horses, rubbing them down, keeping their hooves clean, and speaking softly to them when they grew restless in the cold nights. The three of them shared long evenings around the fire. Daniel would sit sharpening his tools. Naya would stir a pot, and Ayoka often sat near the doorway, staring out at the snowy land as if listening for danger. Though silence filled much of their time, it was not the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of people learning to survive together. But survival was never simple. Food grew scarce, the cattle grew thin, and Daniel knew he might lose half the herd before spring. He spent hours riding out, searching for patches of grass beneath the snow, leading the animals to any place they could eat. Often he returned with his clothes frozen stiff and his face red from wind. Each time Naya scolded him gently and pressed warm herbs against his hands to bring back the blood. The strain of the season tested their patience. One evening, when the wind howled outside and the stew pot held only a thin broth, Ayoka slammed her bowl down. "We cannot live like this forever. We are starving. The people in town will not starve like us. Why do we not take what we need?" Daniel lifted his eyes slowly from the fire. "Because stealing makes us no better than those who would take from us. We survive by our own hands, not by another man's loss." Her eyes flashed with frustration. "And what if they come to take from us first?" Daniel's voice was calm but steady. "Then we fight to protect what's ours. But until then, we live with honor." The words settled heavily in the room. Naya placed her hand over Ayoka's to quiet her anger. After a moment, Ayoka sighed and looked away, though the fire in her eyes did not go out. The storm outside was not only made of snow and wind. Trouble in the land grew closer. The ranchers who had warned Daniel before had not forgotten. They saw his ranch as weak, an easy mark, especially now in the hard winter when supplies were low. One night, while Daniel slept lightly with his rifle near his bed, he heard a noise outside. He rose quietly, slipped on his boots, and stepped into the frozen dark. The moon lit the ground, and in its pale light, Daniel saw shadows moving near the barn. He crouched low, his rifle ready. Two figures were pulling at the door, trying to break the lock. Daniel stepped forward, his voice cutting through the night. "Leave now," he said. The men froze. One turned, his face hidden beneath a scarf. "We just want a little feed." "You've got more than enough." Daniel raised the rifle. "Not one handful leaves this ranch." The men hesitated, then slowly backed away, muttering curses as they mounted their horses and rode off into the night. When Daniel returned inside, Ayoka was awake, her eyes blazing. "You should have shot them," she hissed. Daniel shook his head. "No, words are enough when words can work. A man only pulls a trigger when there's no other choice." Ayoka said nothing, but her fists remained tight. Naya, watching them both, knew the truth. Daniel's restraint was not weakness. It was strength of a kind few men understood. The rest of winter dragged on with more trials. One morning, a calf slipped on the ice and broke its leg. Daniel was ready to give it up for dead, but Naya refused. She worked with herbs, binding and treating the wound, teaching Daniel patience when his hope was thin. Weeks later, the calf stood again, weak but alive. It was a small victory, but in the harsh season, it felt like a miracle. Then came the outlaws. It was late afternoon when three rough-looking riders appeared on the horizon, approaching the ranch with slow, deliberate steps. Daniel saw them from the porch and felt the air shift. These were not hungry neighbors or curious wanderers. These were men who lived by taking, men who smelled weakness and came to exploit it. The leader, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, tipped his hat mockingly as he rode up. "Evening, cowboy. We heard you've got supplies stashed here. Times are hard. Thought we'd help ourselves." Daniel stood firm, his rifle across his arm. "Turn around and ride on. Nothing here belongs to you." The outlaw grinned. "You're outnumbered, cowboy. Don't be foolish. Hand it over and no one gets hurt." Before Daniel could reply, Ayoka stepped out of the cabin, bow in hand, her eyes sharp. Naya followed, holding a spear that had belonged to Dakota. The outlaws laughed at first, but the sound died quickly when they saw the steady way the women held their weapons. Daniel's voice cut the air like steel. "You'll leave now, or you'll find out we stand together." For a long moment, the standoff hung heavy in the cold air. Then the scar-faced man spat on the ground and sneered. "This ain't over." With that, the three outlaws turned their horses and rode away. Daniel lowered his rifle slowly. Ayoka's chest rose and fell with the rush of battle, but her aim had not wavered. Naya stood calm, her strength quiet but unshaken. That night by the fire, Daniel looked at them both with deep respect. "You fought like warriors today. This ranch is not just mine, it's ours now." Ayoka smiled faintly, pride softening her sharpness. Naya nodded, her calm eyes glowing in the firelight. From that day, the ranch was no longer a place of divided lives. It was a fortress built on unity. Daniel, Naya, and Ayoka worked side by side, not as protector and dependents, but as partners in survival. The land still tested them and danger still circled, but their bond was stronger than the cold, stronger than the whispers, stronger even than the greed of outlaws. And though the world outside might never understand, within the walls of that ranch, a family had been forged in the fire of hardship. Spring came at last, slow but certain. The snow melted into streams that cut across the land, and patches of green pushed their way through the dry soil. Daniel's ranch, though scarred by the harsh winter, stood firm. The cattle were thinner but alive. The horses, cared for by Ayoka's steady hands, were strong and restless, ready for the open fields again. And the house itself, though weathered by storms, carried the warmth of people who had endured together. For Daniel, the season felt like a breath of hope. He had carried the ranch through hunger, cold, and danger, but more than that, he had carried his promise, and it had grown into something deeper than duty. In town, the whispers had not stopped, but they had changed. People still spoke of the cowboy who lived with the Apache women, but now their words carried a different edge. Some spoke with respect, saying Daniel had shown more courage than most men. Others, though still bitter, could not deny what they had heard, about how he had fought off outlaws, survived the storms, and worked with the women as equals. Stories traveled faster than truth, but this time the stories made Daniel's name heavier, not weaker. Naya moved with quiet strength through each day. She tended not only the herbs and food, but also the peace of their home. Her wisdom seemed to reach beyond the ranch, for even travelers passing by sometimes stopped to ask for her healing. She gave freely, never turning anyone away. Daniel saw how the settlers, once fearful of her, began to speak of her as the healer woman with respect in their voices. Ayoka grew bolder with the horses. She rode like the wind across the fields, breaking in young colts that Daniel himself struggled to handle. Her laughter, once sharp with anger, now carried joy again, though her spirit remained fiery. In town, men who once mocked Daniel began asking to buy horses trained by Ayoka, impressed by her skill. She never softened her pride, but her eyes no longer carried the same suspicion when they looked at Daniel. Yet, life was never free of tests. One evening, riders appeared again, not settlers, not outlaws, but Apache men. They came in peace this time, carrying no weapons in hand. Their leader was a young warrior Daniel had spoken to months before, one who had doubted his right to keep Dakota's wives. Daniel walked out to meet them, standing tall but calm. The warrior spoke with respect now. "We see what has become of you. You kept your word. You protected them. You did not shame their honor." Naya stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "This is my home now. My spirit walks here." Ayoka, too, lifted her chin. "And mine. No one decides for me but myself." The warriors bowed their heads slightly, accepting their choice. Before leaving, the leader placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Dakota chose well when he gave you this promise." As the riders disappeared into the horizon, Daniel felt the weight on his chest lighten. For the first time, he realized he was no longer standing between two worlds. He was part of both now, tied not by blood but by respect. The months that followed brought new growth. Daniel's ranch flourished. His cattle regained strength, the fields grew green, and trade in town became easier. The same men who once whispered against him now tipped their hats when he passed, their voices quieter, their eyes more thoughtful. The world was changing slowly, and though prejudice had not vanished, it no longer ruled as strongly as before. One day, a group of children from town wandered near the ranch, curious. They had heard stories of the Cowboy's family and wanted to see for themselves. Ayoka showed them the horses, letting them stroke their noses, while Naya gave them herbs for their mothers back home. Daniel stood nearby, watching as laughter filled the air. For the first time, he felt the ranch was no longer a battleground. It was a place of peace. But Daniel knew life would always carry trials. Storms would come again, outlaws might return, and whispers would never fully die. Yet he also knew they would face it together. What had begun as a dying man's last wish had grown into a bond stronger than even blood. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of red and gold across the desert sky, Daniel sat on the porch with Naya and Ayoka. The air was warm, filled with the sounds of crickets and the soft snorts of cattle in the distance. Daniel broke the silence. When I made that promise to Dakota, I thought it would be a burden. I thought I was just carrying a weight I could not put down. He looked at them both, his voice steady. But what I carried gave me back more than I ever had. You've made this ranch a home. You've made my word worth something greater than myself. Naya's calm eyes glistened with quiet pride. A promise kept is not a burden. It is a gift that grows. Ayoka leaned back, her smile small but real. You may have thought you saved us, but perhaps we saved you too. Daniel chuckled softly, looking out at the horizon. Maybe we saved each other. The desert wind swept across the land, carrying with it the scent of earth, grass, and smoke from their fire. Above them, the stars began to glow, countless and bright. The world outside still carried judgment, still carried danger. But within the fences of that ranch, there was unity, there was strength, and there was peace. Years later, when stories of Daniel's ranch were told, people spoke not only of the cowboy who had inherited a dying chief's wives, but of the strange and powerful family that had grown from it. Some called it unusual, others called it honorable. But all agreed on one truth: the promise of one man, the wisdom of one woman, and the fire of another had forged something unbreakable. And long after Daniel, Naya, and Ayoka were gone, the wind across the desert still seemed to whisper their story. The story of a cowboy who kept his word, two women who chose their own path, and a bond that turned suspicion into respect and hardship into love of a deeper kind.